Good evening, everyone. Tonight, let us leave behind the hustle and bustle of the modern world and step into an age of quiet gardens, whispered secrets, and decorum that often masked deeper, more unsettling truths. Imagine a tranquil English village, nestled amongst rolling hills, where time seems to slow, and every face is familiar. Yet, beneath the surface of polite smiles and village gossip, mysteries can bloom, as delicate and as deadly as a nightshade flower. It is in such a place, where appearances can be deceiving, that our story unfolds. So, settle into your favorite armchair, perhaps with a cup of tea, and prepare to observe, as Miss Jane Marple, a woman of gentle mien but sharper intellect than any detective, uncovers the shadowed heart of a mystery. Now, let's start with the first chapter of The Candle in the Attic Window. Chapter 1. The First Flicker. The village of St. Mary Mead, on a late autumn evening in the year 1928, was a symphony of fading light and woods. Miss Jane Marple, perched by her window, watched the last blush of sunset fade behind the yew hedges of the vicarage. Her knitting needles clicked a steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the quietude. But tonight, the usual serenity of the village seemed to harbor a subtle discord, a barely perceptible ripple in the fabric of everyday life. It began, as so many things did in St. Mary Mead, with Mrs. Pettigrew's pronouncement at the village shop. "Have you seen it, dear?" she'd whispered to Mrs. Weatherby, her voice a theatrical stage whisper that carried through the entire establishment. "The light in the attic of Willow Creek Manor. Mrs. Ainsworth's, you know." Willow Creek Manor was a grand, though somewhat neglected, house on the outskirts of the village. Its owner, Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, was a woman of formidable reputation and reclusive habits. She had lived there for 40 years, a widow for most of them, attended only by her faithful housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. Villagers rarely saw Mrs. Ainsworth, save for her brisk walk to church on Sundays, a figure draped in severe black, her face a pale, unreadable mask. The light, Mrs. Pettigrew elaborated, was a candle, a single, flickering candle, right in the topmost attic window, towards the east, mind you, and it was there last night too. And the night before, Miss Marple, who had been selecting a tin of biscuits, caught Mrs. Pettigrew's eye. Indeed, Mrs. Pettigrew, how curious. Mrs. Ainsworth, I believe, has always been most particular about her electricity usage, and the attic, I was under the impression, was quite unused. Exactly, Mrs. Pettigrew exclaimed, delighted to have Miss Marple's attention. "That's what makes it so peculiar. A candle. It's not like her to be. Well, not like her at all." Later that evening, Miss Marple took a turn about her garden. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant bonfires. Her gaze, seemingly idly, drifted towards Willow Creek Manor, a dark, imposing silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. And there it was, a tiny, defiant pinprick of orange light, high in the eastern attic window. It pulsed, a small, living flame, almost like a silent signal. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, ran down Miss Marple's spine. A candle in an unused attic window. It could be a simple oversight, a maid's carelessness, but with Mrs. Ainsworth, nothing was ever simple. She was a woman known for her meticulous order, her precise habits. A forgotten candle seemed utterly out of character. As the flame continued to flicker, a subtle sense of unease settled upon St. Mary Mead, quietly, like the encroaching mist, and Miss Marple, with her gentle, shrewd eyes, observed it all, knowing that even the smallest deviation from the ordinary could often hide the most extraordinary truths. The candle burned, a silent question mark against the night, hinting at a story yet to be told, a secret waiting to be unveiled. Chapter 2. A Frayed Thread. The candle in Mrs. Ainsworth's attic window became the new focal point of village gossip. Pushing aside even the contentious matter of Mrs. Giles's prize-winning marrow, speculation blossomed in the church pew, over teacups, and across garden fences. Was Mrs. Ainsworth ill and sending a signal? Was it a superstitious practice, some forgotten family tradition? Or was it, as young Timothy, the postman, suggested with a theatrical shudder, a ghost? Miss Marple listened, absorbing every theory, every snippet of observation. She learned that the candle appeared precisely at dusk and was extinguished sometime before midnight. It was always in the same window, always a single flame. This consistency intrigued her. Carelessness, as she had first considered, rarely exhibited such punctilious repetition. A few days later, a small incident occurred that, to most peeps, seemed utterly unrelated. Mrs. Gable, Mrs. Ainsworth's housekeeper of 30 years, appeared at the village shop, looking unusually flustered. Her usually immaculate grey hair was slightly askew, and her lips, usually set in a thin, disapproving line, trembled. She purchased an odd assortment of items, a large bottle of disinfectant, a length of coarse twine, and, most surprisingly, a child's wooden spinning top. "Everything quite all right, Mrs. Gable?" inquired Mr. Hemming, the shopkeeper, who rarely saw Mrs. Gable deviate from her weekly order. Mrs. Gable gave a curt nod. "Just a bit of a turn. The mistress. She's particular about things being just so. Lost a small trinket, you see. Been quite out of sorts searching for it." She averted her eyes, paid quickly, and departed, leaving Mr. Hemming bewildered by the spinning top. A trinket. Mrs. Ainsworth, a woman who owned priceless antique jewelry, bothered by a lost trinket, and why a child's toy. Miss Marple, hearing this account later from Mr. Hemming, found her interest piqued. A lost trinket. Mrs. Ainsworth, for all her wealth, was known to be rather austere, not one for sentimental baubles, and Mrs. Gable's agitation seemed disproportionate to a missing item, especially one so trivial. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay an unscheduled call to Willow Creek Manor. Ostensibly, she was returning a borrowed gardening book, though she had finished it weeks ago. The house itself was imposing, a Victorian edifice shrouded in ivy. The heavy oak door was answered by Mrs. Gable, whose expression tightened imperceptibly upon seeing Miss Marple. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Gable. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Just returning this, with my compliments," Miss Marple said, offering the book with her sweetest smile. No, Miss Marple. Do come in. The mistress is resting." Mrs. Gable's voice was strained. As Miss Marple stepped into the cool, silent hall, her sharp eyes took in every detail. The faint scent of furniture polish mixed with something else, something sharp and medicinal. On a small mahogany side table, she noticed a faint, circular indentation on the polished wood, almost like a ring mark from a small, heavy object. And then, her gaze drifted upward, to the shadowy recesses of the grand staircase, and briefly, to the very top, where a narrow, almost hidden door hinted at the attic beyond. Mrs. Gable was right about Mrs. Ainsworth being particular, yet a faint thread of frayed carpet on the third stair caught Miss Marple's attention, a minor imperfection that seemed oddly out of place in a house otherwise maintained with such rigid precision. The lost trinket, Mrs. Gable's distress, the candle's unwavering appearance, and now a subtle disarray. The threads of the ordinary were beginning to fray, and Miss Marple felt a distinct sense of unease. Chapter 3. The gathering gloom. The days that followed brought a chilling escalation to the quiet mystery. Mrs. Ainsworth, it was announced by Dr. Finch, had taken a turn for the worse. A severe chill, he pronounced, complicated by her advanced age. The doctor, a man of brusque efficiency, was now a frequent visitor at Willow Creek Manor, his motorcar an incongruous sight, parked amidst the ancient youth. Miss Marple observed Dr. Finch's comings and goings with a quiet intensity. He was a capable physician, but also a man known for his practical, no-nonsense approach, often dismissing emotional nuances as mere feminine fancy. She wondered what he made of Mrs. Ainsworth's situation beyond the medical diagnosis. Villagers expressed their concerns, though few dared to call directly at the manor. Such was Mrs. Ainsworth's formidable reputation. Mrs. Gable, when seen at the shop, was a picture of weary resignation. Her face pinched, her eyes shadowed. She spoke little, offering only terse updates on the mistress's deteriorating health. Yet, even in her exhaustion, Miss Marple noted a certain guardedness in Mrs. Gable's demeanor, a reluctance to meet eyes, as if she carried a private burden. And still, the candle burned. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, its tiny flame would appear in the attic window, a silent vigil. It seemed to defy the somber atmosphere pervading the manor, a persistent flicker of light in the gathering gloom. If Mrs. Ainsworth was gravely ill, confined to her bed, who was lighting it, and why? It struck Miss Marple as odd that an invalid's household, usually rife with activity and concern, would maintain such a peculiar, nightly ritual without explanation. One afternoon, Miss Marple, ostensibly on an errand to deliver a pot of her homemade black-currant jam for Mrs. Ainsworth, a gesture of village sympathy often impossible to refuse, found herself in the manor's drawing-room, Mrs. Gable having left her briefly to attend to her mistress. The room, usually kept in a state of meticulous, almost museum-like order, seemed subtly disturbed. A cushion was slightly askew, a book left open on a table, and a small silver snuff-box, usually nestled amongst a collection of porcelain figures, was placed haphazardly beside a half-empty teacup. Her gaze, however, was drawn to a small, ornate porcelain pillbox on the mantelpiece. It was open, and inside were several small, white tablets, a common enough sight in an ailing person's home. But as Miss Marple's eyes, trained by years of observation of human nature and household details, lingered, she noticed a faint, almost imperceptible residue on the lip of the box, a fine, powdery dust, lighter than the porcelain, clinging to the edge. It could be nothing, a speck of dust, or the residue of the pills themselves. But Miss Marple had a nose for inconsistencies. She recalled Dr. Finch's precise methods, his prescriptions always carefully dispensed from sealed bottles. The open pillbox, the residue, combined with Mrs. Gable's strange secrecy and the unceasing candle in the attic, created a pattern of disquiet. Mrs. Ainsworth was fading, her life ebbing away, and yet the elements around her seemed to conspire to tell a different story, a story of subtle manipulation and hidden intent. The chill Miss Marple felt was no longer just from the autumn air. It was the icy breath of something far more sinister. Chapter 4. A Quiet Passing. The inevitable news arrived a week later, carried by Dr. Finch's solemn face and the drawing of the blinds at Willow Creek Manor. Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, at the age of 82, had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The cause, as stated by the doctor, was natural decline, exacerbated by the recent chill. The village offered its condolences, though few expressed genuine surprise. Mrs. Ainsworth had been an old woman, and her reclusive life meant she was mourned more out of duty than deep affection. The funeral was a sparsely attended affair, mostly distant relatives and a handful of villagers. Miss Marple was present, a quiet observer in her sensible black dress. She noted the somber, almost relieved, expression on Mrs. Gable's face, a weariness that seemed to lift, even as her eyes remained red-rimmed. Among the mourners was Mrs. Ainsworth's nephew, Arthur Ainsworth, a man in his late 40s, who had travelled from London. He was a rather florid-faced gentleman, with a booming laugh that seemed perpetually on the verge of escaping, even at a funeral. He spoke effusively about his dear Aunt Eleanor, though few in the village recalled him visiting more than once a decade. Miss Marple observed him with her usual quiet scrutiny, noting the way his gaze lingered on the manor's gables, not with sentimental longing, but with an almost proprietorial air. A terrible loss, Miss Marple, truly terrible, Arthur declared to her after the service, catching her by the arm. Though, one must confess, Aunt Eleanor had a good innings, and at least she's at peace now. All those peculiar habits she developed in her old age. He trailed off, shaking his head. Peculiar habits? Miss Marple inquired gently, her eyes wide with innocent curiosity. Arthur chuckled, a little too loudly. Oh, you know, the eccentricities of the elderly, imagining things, fretting over trifles. She grew quite particular towards the end, but a good heart, a truly good heart. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze momentarily drifting towards Willow Creek Manor, where the attic window, for the first time in weeks, was utterly dark. No candle. Its disappearance was as striking as its former presence. The villagers, ever ready with an explanation, assumed it had been a signal of her lingering illness, perhaps a final, unspoken farewell. With Mrs. Ainsworth gone, the candle had naturally ceased, but Miss Marple did not think so. The candle had been burning before Mrs. Ainsworth's precipitous decline. It had appeared in an unused attic, a place Mrs. Ainsworth, with her precise nature, would have little reason to visit. It seemed too coincidental, too neat, for the candle's cessation to merely mark the end of a life. The impression of a faint powder on the pillbox, Mrs. Gable's agitated silence, Arthur Ainsworth's curious possessiveness, and the persistent candle, they formed a disjointed narrative in Miss Marple's mind. As the mourners dispersed, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Dr. Finch. "A quiet passing, Doctor," she remarked. "Indeed, Miss Marple, a blessing, really." She'd been failing for some time. Her heart, you see, was weak, no doubt about it. Dr. Finch sounded unusually emphatic, almost defensive. Miss Marple merely hummed, a gentle, non-committal sound. She had observed Dr. Finch's professional confidence for years. Today, however, there was a subtle tremor in his voice, an undercurrent of something that did not quite sit right. The peaceful passing of Mrs. Ainsworth, far from resolving the mystery of the candle, had only deepened it, adding a chilling new layer to the unfolding puzzle. Chapter 5. whispers of inheritance. The reading of Mrs. Ainsworth's will was, for St. Mary Mead, a much anticipated event. Though not present herself, Miss Marple soon heard the details, relayed through the efficient channels of village communication. Mr. Long, the solicitor from Much Deeping, held court in the manor's drawing-room, with Arthur Ainsworth and Mrs. Gable as the primary beneficiaries. Arthur, as expected, inherited the bulk of the estate, including Willow Creek Manor itself, and a substantial sum of money. There were smaller bequests to distant cousins, but it was the bequest to Mrs. Gable that raised eyebrows and fueled the most fervent discussions. Mrs. Gable, the loyal housekeeper, was left a generous annuity, enough to ensure a comfortable retirement and a small cottage on the edge of the manor's grounds. A most generous provision, considering, Mrs. Pettigrew declared, tapping her chin at the village shop, though one always thought Mrs. Ainsworth a mite stingy, and after all those years, Mrs. Gable certainly deserved something. Miss Marple, however, found the generosity intriguing. Mrs. Ainsworth was indeed known for her frugality, and while Mrs. Gable's loyalty was undeniable, the sum seemed almost strategic. It ensured her comfortable silence. Perhaps Arthur Ainsworth, now the undisputed master of Willow Creek Manor, wasted no time in making his presence felt. He began overseeing immediate renovations, much to the dismay of the village estates, who appreciated the manor's venerable, if slightly dilapidated, charm. He hired a small team of workmen from out of town, bustling about the house, often with a measuring tape in hand and a self-satisfied smirk. He spoke frequently of modernizing the old place, installing new plumbing, even perished the thought, an electric stove. Miss Marple, walking past the manor one afternoon, saw Arthur directing a foreman, pointing animatedly towards the attic. "That window, there," he gestured. "I want it boarded up, completely. Don't like the draft, and it's quite useless now anyway." A chill wind seemed to sweep through Miss Marple as she heard this. The attic window, the very one where the candle had burned, to board it up so hastily, so completely, seemed an act of deliberate erasure. What was Arthur trying to conceal, or perhaps simply forget? Later that day, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Gable, ostensibly to offer her condolences once more and inquire about her plans. She found the housekeeper in the small cottage she had inherited, amidst boxes, quietly packing. Mrs. Gable looked remarkably less strained than she had in weeks, almost relieved, though a deep weariness still clung to her. "The mistress was very good to me, Miss Marple," Mrs. Gable said, her voice softer than usual. "More than good. I shall miss her terribly. In my own way, she certainly left you well provided for." Miss Marple observed gently, stirring her tea. "A testament to your loyalty, no doubt." Mrs. Gable's hands, as she smoothed a piece of fabric, trembled slightly. "Indeed, she always said I would be looked after, especially after the incident." She caught herself, her eyes flicking nervously towards the window. "The incident?" Miss Marple prompted, her voice still mild. Mrs. Gable hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing, Miss Marple, just a misunderstanding, many years ago. It's all past now. I merely meant she was a woman of her word." She quickly changed the subject, asking about Miss Marple's own garden, but the phrase "the incident" hung in the air, an unspoken question, an incident that had cemented Mrs. Gable's loyalty, perhaps even her future. And Arthur's haste to board up the attic window, coupled with his convenient dismissal of Mrs. Ainsworth's peculiar habits, suddenly seemed less about modernizing and more about burying a past that still lingered, much like a candle's memory, in that very attic window. Miss Marple knew then that the truth lay not in Mrs. Ainsworth's peaceful passing, but in a past event, carefully concealed, now threatening to unravel. Chapter 6. A Hidden Letter. The boarding up of the attic window at Willow Creek Manor proceeded with surprising speed. Within days, the offending aperture, once a source of village mystery, was covered by rough planks, sealing off its secrets. Arthur Ainsworth oversaw the work with a zeal that struck Miss Marple as almost frantic. He truly seemed intent on erasing the candle's memory. But secrets, like seeds, often find a way to sprout, even from the most barren ground. Mrs. Gable, in the midst of packing her possessions from the manor servant quarters before moving to her new cottage, stumbled upon something unexpected. Tucked beneath the worn lining of an old hatbox, forgotten for decades, was a small, leather-bound journal and a single, yellowed letter. Recognizing Mrs. Ainsworth's elegant hand, Mrs. Gable felt a pang of guilt. These were private, personal items. Mrs. Ainsworth had been a fiercely private woman, but something compelled her to read the letter. A brittle document dated nearly 40 years prior. Its contents, though vague in places, sent a cold shiver down her spine. The letter was addressed to a dearest Robert, and spoke of a terrible mistake, a fearful secret, and the urgent need for discretion above all. It hinted at a significant financial transaction, a sum paid to ensure silence and safety. But what truly caught Mrs. Gable's attention was a repeated phrase: "The light in the west attic window will be our signal." One flicker for affirmation, two for danger. Never forget. Mrs. Gable, her hands trembling, immediately thought of the east attic window, where the candle had burned for weeks. Not the west, but the east. A difference, but perhaps a deliberate one, a confusion of directions. She knew the manor intimately. There were indeed two small attic windows, one facing east, one west. Mrs. Ainsworth had always referred to the main attic window, implying a primary focus on one. Could it be a family code, rediscovered by Mrs. Ainsworth in her final days, or perhaps even used against her? Disturbed by the discovery, and unsure whom to trust, Mrs. Gable, with a sudden impulse, decided to confide in Miss Marple. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage one blustery afternoon, looking considerably paler than usual, clutching the journal and letter as if they were fragile birds. Miss Marple listened patiently, her eyes taking in every nuance of Mrs. Gable's distress. She carefully examined the letter, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Dearest Robert," she mused aloud. "Do you recall if Mrs. Ainsworth had any connection to a Robert?" Mrs. Gable shook her head. "Never heard the name mentioned, Miss Marple." "Not once. She spoke little of her past, even to me. Her husband, Mr. Ainsworth, died shortly after they moved here. No children." Miss Marple's gaze returned to the cryptic passage about the candle signals. One flicker for affirmation, two for danger, and the west attic window. She paused, a thoughtful expression settling on her features. "It is curious, Mrs. Gable, that the candle we observed was in the east attic window. A subtle but significant discrepancy, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Gable nodded, bewildered. "Indeed, Miss Marple, it makes no sense. The whole house is full of old things, but this," she gestured to the letter, "this feels different, almost urgent." Miss Marple carefully placed the letter back in its envelope. "This incident you mentioned earlier, Mrs. Gable, the one that cemented your loyalty to Mrs. Ainsworth, was it, by any chance, connected to a secret?" She watched Mrs. Gable's face closely. Mrs. Gable flinched, her eyes wide with fear. I cannot say, Miss Marple. I promised. It was a long time ago, before the candle, before everything." Her voice was barely a whisper. The discovery of the letter had reawakened old fears, old promises, and Miss Marple, connecting the dots between an old secret, a forgotten code, and a very public, very recent candle, felt the puzzle pieces shift once more. The candle in the attic window was not a new development, but a reverberation of a much older, deeper secret, now eerily echoing across time, demanding to be heard. Chapter 7. Echoes from the Past. Miss Marple spent the next few days in quiet contemplation, rereading the yellowed letter and considering Mrs. Gable's reticence. The phrase, the incident, weighed heavily on her mind. Mrs. Ainsworth's past, once a closed book, was slowly, reluctantly, yielding its pages. The letter hinted at a terrible mistake and a sum paid for silence, suggesting something beyond mere scandal. Her thoughts turned to the journal Mrs. Gable had also found. It was less a diary and more a book of pressed flowers and botanical notes, kept by Mrs. Ainsworth in her younger years. However, tucked between the dried petals of a forget-me-not, Miss Marple discovered a folded newspaper clipping. It was old, faded, detailing the tragic disappearance of a young woman named Clara Maxwell from a neighboring village. Nearly 40 years ago, the clipping mentioned a local landowner, a Mr. Robert Carmichael, who had been briefly questioned but cleared due to lack of evidence. A handsome, charismatic man, the article described, known for his philandering. Miss Marple's mind, ever agile, made the immediate connection. Dearest Robert, could Robert Carmichael be the recipient of the letter? And was Clara Maxwell's disappearance the terrible mistake? It seemed plausible. The timing aligned perfectly with the letter's date and Mrs. Ainsworth's move to Willow Creek Manor. But what did this have to do with the candle? The letter specified the west attic window as a signal. The observed candle was in the east attic window. A crucial detail. Was someone trying to communicate, or deliberately mislead? Miss Marple decided a quiet conversation with Dr. Finch was in order. She paid him a visit, under the guise of inquiring about a troublesome rose blight. After discussing the health of her roses, she gently steered the conversation. "Poor Mrs. Ainsworth," she began, her voice soft. "Such a reserved woman. One wonders what stories she carried, doesn't one? Such a private life." Dr. Finch, polishing his spectacles, grunted. "Indeed, a good woman, Miss Marple, but a lifetime of secrets. Kept herself to herself. Did she ever speak of an old acquaintance, a Mr. Robert Carmichael, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked, watching him carefully. Dr. Finch paused, his hand freezing on his spectacles. His face, usually ruddy, paled slightly. "Carmichael? Good heavens, that name hasn't been uttered in this village for decades. A rotter, by all accounts. Caused quite a stir, didn't he? Always wondered what became of him." He quickly changed the subject, discussing the latest medical advancements, his earlier brusqueness replaced by a noticeable nervousness. Miss Marple registered the reaction. The name clearly struck a chord, and not a pleasant one. Her next call was to the vicar, Mr. Clement. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local families and history. "Vicar," she began, "I was wondering about the old Ainsworth family records. Do you recall if Mrs. Ainsworth, before she was Mrs. Ainsworth, was ever associated with a family by the name of Maxwell?" The vicar, after a moment of thought, consulted his parish register. Maxwell. Ah, yes. Eleanor Maxwell. That was Mrs. Ainsworth's maiden name. She married Mr. Ainsworth, a prosperous merchant, very shortly after arriving in St. Mary Mead. A rather quick engagement, as I recall, given her apparent reticence. She had just moved from the Maxwell family home in Lower Snailwell, the same village where Clara Maxwell had disappeared. The pieces were beginning to coalesce with chilling clarity. Eleanor Maxwell, the respectable Mrs. Ainsworth, was related to the vanished Clara Maxwell. Dearest Robert was Robert Carmichael, the suspect, and Mrs. Gable's incident was undoubtedly tied to this dark episode. The candle in the attic window was not merely a recent mystery. It was an echo from a buried past, a silent alarm, and Miss Marple realized, with a sinking feeling, that the terrible secret had returned to haunt Willow Creek Manor, and perhaps to claim its final victim. The quiet passing of Mrs. Ainsworth now seemed anything but natural. Chapter 8. The Shadowed Past Unveiled. The connections Miss Marple had made were startling in their implications. Eleanor Maxwell, the sister of the vanished Clara Maxwell, married to a man who might have been involved in Clara's disappearance, then moving swiftly to St. Mary Mead as Mrs. Ainsworth. The letter to dearest Robert Carmichael, the terrible mistake, and the financial payment for silence and safety. It painted a picture of a past crime, meticulously covered up. But what about the candle? The letter specified the *west attic window as the signal. The candle everyone saw was in the *east*. Was this a mistake on the part of the person lighting it, or a deliberate misdirection? Miss Marple considered this, along with Arthur Ainsworth's suspicious eagerness to board up the east attic window. She decided to revisit Mrs. Gable. This time, Miss Marple brought with her a small photograph she had carefully clipped from the old newspaper, a blurred image of Clara Maxwell. "Mrs. Gable," Miss Marple began gently, holding out the photograph. "Does this young woman resemble Mrs. Ainsworth in her youth?" Mrs. Gable took the photo, her eyes widening. "Oh my word, yes. A spitting image of Mrs. Ainsworth when she was Eleanor Maxwell, her younger sister, Clara, wasn't it? I've seen this picture before, years ago, in a locked box the mistress kept." Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with dawning comprehension. "So, the letter, and Mr. Carmichael, it was all true." "What was all true, Mrs. Gable?" Miss Marple pressed, her gaze unwavering. Mrs. Gable wrung her hands. "Many years ago, when I first came to work for Mrs. Ainsworth, she was often distraught. There was talk, whispers of an affair, a pregnancy, and then Clara's disappearance. Mrs. Ainsworth was beside herself. She confided in me once, in a moment of great distress, that Clara had run away with a married man, Robert Carmichael, and that he had abandoned her. Mrs. Ainsworth swore me to secrecy, saying that her sister had brought shame on the family. She was to live a quiet, respectable life here in St. Mary Mead, far from the scandal. She mentioned paying a sum to someone, a fixer, to ensure the family name was spared further ignominy, and to find Clara. Though she never truly believed Clara would be found alive, she hinted at a tragic accident, and the candle signal. Miss Marple asked, her voice low. "Ah, that. Mrs. Gable said, her eyes distant. Mrs. Ainsworth had a theory. She believed Clara, if she were ever truly in danger and needed to communicate from the old Maxwell family home, which, you see, was just down the lane from Carmichael's estate, would use the candle in the west attic window. A prearranged signal between the sisters. It was a private thing, a secret hope, she said, though she never really believed it would be used. So, Mrs. Ainsworth believed Clara might signal for help, but she never did, Miss Marple clarified. And yet, a candle appeared in her attic, in St. Mary Mead, just before her death. Yes, and that's what troubles me, Miss Marple, Mrs. Gable admitted. Towards the end, when the candle first started appearing, Mrs. Ainsworth was very weak, but she kept muttering, "The signal, it's wrong. It's the wrong window. Why is it in the wrong window? I thought it was just the ramblings of an old woman, confused by her illness." A powerful revelation hit Miss Marple. The candle in the east attic window was not Clara's signal. It was Mrs. Ainsworth's own desperate attempt to communicate, using a distorted version of her sister's old code, perhaps to warn someone that she, too, was in danger, or that something was gravely amiss. The wrong window wasn't confusion. It was Mrs. Ainsworth's subconscious, trying to alert someone that the signal was a false asterisk signal, or that it was being used by another asterisk. The candle, which the village had interpreted as a sign of Mrs. Ainsworth's illness or eccentricity, was in fact her silent cry for help, a last, desperate plea from the depths of Willow Creek Manor. She was trying to warn of a danger linked to the old secret, a danger that had finally caught up to her, and the person who had lit the candle each night, maintaining its eerie vigil, was either the very person she was trying to warn, or someone else entirely, manipulating the symbol for their own sinister ends. Miss Marple knew she was perilously close to the truth, and that Mrs. Ainsworth's peaceful passing was anything but. The final, shocking pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place. Chapter 9. The trap is sprung. With the full weight of Mrs. Ainsworth's past, and her final, desperate attempt at communication now clear, Miss Marple knew the culprit was someone closely tied to both the manor and the old secret. Her gaze narrowed on two individuals: Arthur Ainsworth, who stood to inherit everything and whose haste to board up the attic windows seemed suspicious, and Mrs. Gable, who knew the full extent of Mrs. Ainsworth's past and had received a generous, almost silencing, bequest. Miss Marple decided on a subtle approach, a gentle tightening of the net. She arranged a tea party at her cottage, inviting Arthur, Mrs. Gable, and Dr. Finch. She wanted to observe their reactions, their subtle tells, when confronted with carefully placed information. During the polite chatter, Miss Marple, with a twinkle in her eye, turned to Arthur. "Mr. Ainsworth, I was just admiring this old photograph I came across recently. It's a remarkable resemblance, wouldn't you say, to your late aunt when she was a young woman?" She handed him the newspaper clipping of Clara Maxwell. Arthur took it, his florid face paling slightly as he saw the name Clara Maxwell and the date. He cleared his throat. "Indeed, Miss Marple, a rather striking resemblance. Aunt Eleanor never spoke much of her younger days. A very private person, you know." He quickly passed the clipping to Dr. Finch, dismissing it with a nervous laugh. Dr. Finch, upon seeing the clipping, gave a visible start. He gripped the photo tightly. "Clara Maxwell. I remember the stir that caused. A sad business." He cast a quick, uneasy glance at Mrs. Gable, who had grown very still. Miss Marple then spoke, her voice light and conversational. "It's curious, isn't it, how old secrets have a way of resurfacing?" Mrs. Ainsworth, in her final days, spoke to Mrs. Gable about a prearranged signal with her sister, Clara, a candle in the west attic window, to signal danger. Yet, the candle we all observed was in the east attic window, a rather baffling discrepancy, don't you think? Mrs. Gable gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Arthur's face hardened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Dr. Finch, however, turned a shade of grey. He stared at Miss Marple, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "Such a strange confusion of directions," Miss Marple continued, pouring tea with unhurried grace. "Unless, of course, the wrong window was a signal in itself, a warning that the person lighting the candle was not who Mrs. Ainsworth expected, or that the danger was internal, within the very house." She paused, her eyes, though kindly, holding an undeniable sharpness. "Mrs. Ainsworth, poor dear, was trying to tell someone that the old code was being used against her, or that she was in peril from within. "The signal is wrong," she murmured, "according to Mrs. Gable." Mrs. Gable, now trembling, nodded vehemently. Yes, those were her very words. Arthur stood up abruptly, knocking over a teacup. "This is preposterous." Aunt Eleanor was a confused old woman. "You're weaving fantasies from old gossip and senile ramblings." His voice was loud, defensive, but Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on Dr. Finch. "And then there was the matter of the pillbox, Doctor. The one on Mrs. Ainsworth's mantelpiece. It contained small white tablets, and a fine, light powder residue on its rim. Not from the pills themselves, I believe, but from something else. Something easily crushable, perhaps, and administered in small, escalating doses. Something that would mimic natural decline, especially in an elderly patient with a weak heart." Dr. Finch recoiled as if struck. His hand went to his throat. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" he stammered, his usual professional composure utterly shattered. "I am merely stating what my observations suggest." Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but firm. "The missing trinket Mrs. Gable spoke of a child's spinning top, perhaps a small heavy object that could have been used to crush something into a fine powder. A powder that would hasten a weak heart's demise, slowly, discreetly, over weeks, making it appear entirely natural. And the disinfectant Mrs. Gable bought, perhaps to clean up any remaining residue, though some, inevitably, lingered." Arthur looked from Miss Marple to Dr. Finch, his face a mask of dawning horror. Mrs. Gable stared at the doctor, betrayal and revulsion writ large on her features. The air in the room crackled with unspoken accusation. Miss Marple had not directly accused anyone, but her carefully constructed narrative, woven from subtle details and psychological insights, had pierced the veil of deceit. The truth, like a cold, venomous serpent, had begun to uncoil itself in the drawing-room of her quiet cottage. The climax was close. Chapter 10. The Unveiling. The silence in Miss Marple's drawing-room was palpable, thick with accusation and dread. Dr. Finch, his face ashen, stumbled back into his chair, breathing heavily. Arthur Ainsworth stood frozen, his earlier bluster replaced by a terrified understanding. Mrs. Gable watched Dr. Finch with an expression of profound shock and anger. Miss Marple, ever gentle but unyielding, poured herself a fresh cup of tea. "It is an unfortunate truth," she began, her voice soft, "that greed can twist even the most reputable amongst us. Dr. Finch, you were aware of Mrs. Ainsworth's weak heart. You had access, and you knew of the will. Arthur here would inherit the manor, but Mrs. Ainsworth's substantial liquid assets would need to be handled, and a doctor, as an executor or simply as a confidant, would have significant influence, a steady income, perhaps a share of the estate under some undisclosed arrangement, without attracting undue attention, a comfortable future, paid for by a quiet, natural passing." Dr. Finch finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "This is madness, conjecture. I'm a respected medical professional." "Indeed, you are, Doctor," Miss Marple agreed calmly, "which is why you understood precisely how to administer a subtle, undetectable poison, slowly, over time, that would mimic the symptoms of a failing heart. The residue on the pillbox, the spinning top Mrs. Gable purchased, perhaps used to crush the substance, these were not incidental details. Mrs. Ainsworth was not merely confused when she spoke of the wrong window. She was trying to tell us that someone else was lighting the candle, not in the pre-arranged signal window, but in a different one. She was trying to warn us that she was being systematically poisoned, that her life was being stolen, not by an external threat from the past, but by someone within her intimate circle, someone she trusted implicitly, her doctor. Arthur Ainsworth finally found his voice. "But the candle. Why, the candle?" Dr. Finch remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple answered for him. "The candle in the *East* attic window, which everyone assumed was a signal of Mrs. Ainsworth's decline, was, I believe, part of Dr. Finch's insidious plan. He knew of Mrs. Ainsworth's sister's old signet, perhaps through discussions with Mrs. Ainsworth herself, in her more lucid moments, or through the old letter he might have discovered while visiting. He lit it, knowing it would confuse, knowing it would be seen as an eccentricity of an old woman, or a simple sign of illness. It served to normalize the abnormal, to provide a comforting, albeit false, explanation for the growing unease in the house. It was a macabre misdirection, a symbolic vigil for a life he was actively ending. Miss Marple continued, her voice gaining a quiet authority. Mrs. Ainsworth, even in her weakened state, recognized the discrepancy. The *east* window, not the *west*. She knew the signal was being misused, and that the person lighting it was not her sister, but her betrayer. Her frantic murmurs of the wrong window were not confusion, but a final, desperate plea for help, an attempt to expose the treachery happening in her own home. Mrs. Gable burst into tears. And the trinket, the lost spinning top, Mrs. Ainsworth had spoken of it. It was a gift from Clara, years ago. She kept it hidden, a secret solace. Dr. Finch must have found it, used it to crush the poison, and then pretended it was just a lost item, sending me to buy another to replace it, knowing I would be distracted. Dr. Finch, defeated, finally lifted his head. His eyes held a chilling mixture of despair and malevolence. He tried to speak, but only a strangled sound emerged. The weight of Miss Marple's gentle, precise unravelling of his crime had utterly crushed him. The local constable was called, and Dr. Finch was taken away, his carefully constructed life of respectability crumbling around him. Arthur Ainsworth, reeling from the shock, vowed to cooperate fully with the authorities. Mrs. Gable, heartbroken but resolute, prepared to give her full testimony, her loyalty to Mrs. Ainsworth finally able to honor the truth. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly. The village was quiet again, but the silence now held the memory of a dark secret brought to light. The candle in the attic window, once a symbol of mystery, had become a testament to the quiet suffering of Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, and to the extraordinary intuition of a gentle old maid from St. Mary Mead. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the quiet corners of an English village. I hope you've enjoyed unraveling this mystery with Miss Marple.